Say what you like about social media and the conspiracy theories that flourishes there, but you gotta admit, they gives us lots of insights into how sensational, viral stories could have spread even as far back as the 1st century. Hey there, folks. Bert from the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. Last time, Dr. Craig tried to argue that the gospel story couldn't be a legend on account of legends supposedly taking hundreds of years to develop. But that ignores the fact that there's more than one kind of legend, and that stories about so-called miracle workers has to be more or less legendary from day one, because the success of the miracle worker depends on convincing folks to believe impossible things is actually happening. So Dr. Craig's argument there is a complete non-starter. As anybody with access to social media can verify, they ain't no centuries-long waiting period before folks can start spreading viral stories that ain't actually true. And I do hope that the legends take centuries argument weren't supposed to be the groundbreaking research that he promised us at the beginning of the chapter, which was supposed to refute all critical scholarship and establish the Gospels as reliable history. 'Cause that it definitely was not. The book by Professor Sherwin-White that he was citing weren't even peer-reviewed and was published more than half a century ago. That in itself is bad enough, but as it turns out, Dr. Craig ain't even correct in what he reported Professor Sherwin-White as saying. Sherwin-White weren't talking about the gospel writers being reliable sources for every claim that they made. He was just saying that careful historians could still glean some fact-checkable details about Roman trials in the 1st century. And he definitely weren't arguing that it takes 200 or 300 years for folks to twist the facts to suit a particular agenda. Heck, the way Dr. Craig quotes Professor Sherwin-White is itself an example of a report being distorted only a few decades after it was published. If you'd like more information on what Professor Sherwin-White was actually talking about, there's an article on it from Dr. Richard Carrier, and I'll put a link in the description. He's got a link to a PDF of Sherwin-White's original book, too, if any really wants to dig into it. In any case, the point is that, no, it categorically ain't true that there was insufficient time for the story of Jesus' life to be embellished with miraculous and fanciful details that made him out to be more than he was. Anytime you has a famous faith healer and miracle worker, there's gonna be contemporary stories about him doing amazing magical things, 'cause that's the whole job description of a faith healer and miracle worker. If them stories ain't spreading already while he's still alive, he never gonna get to be a famous faith healer / miracle worker, obviously. And of course, the historian's job is to sift through all the stories and fact-check the claims. And when you do that, you find out that the stories ain't consistent with what we actually observe in the real world, or even with each other a lot of the time. And that's why Dr. Craig don't want believers listening to anybody who actually fact-checks the Gospels. But I reckon we might as well go on ahead and let him argue his next point as best he can. Quote, "Now on to my 5th point. The Gospel writers have a proven track record of historical reliability. Again, let's look at just one example, Luke." End quote. So notice what Dr. Craig does not say here. He does not say that the Gospel writers has a proven track record of reliability when it comes to claims about supernatural events. He can't make that claim because it ain't true. And unfortunately for Dr. Craig, that's kind of the whole point here. If an apologist could prove that the Gospel writers was reliable when they makes claims about the supernatural, then they wouldn't even need to be making all these other arguments. But they can't do that. The best they can argue is that they can cherry-pick instances where the Gospel writers referred to ordinary, mundane, non-supernatural details that historians can confirm is true. And then they jump from there to the conclusion that therefore all claims made by the Gospel writers must also be true. and that's just gullibility. Believing everything that somebody says just because they say so is the definition of gullibility. It'd be incredibly naive to assume that there's just two kinds of folks in the world and that either somebody tells the exact truth 100% of the time or else they lies 100% of the time. Sometimes folks makes mistakes, sometimes they's misinformed, sometimes they distort the facts like Dr. Craig did with his discussion of Sherwin-White, sometimes they outright lies. But even the folks that tells lies tells the truth a lot of the time about details that ain't important to their agenda. So it'd be naive and gullible to assume that if anybody ever tells the truth or often tells the truth, that means they always tell the truth. But now, well, you tell me whether or not that's exactly the assumption that Dr. Craig wants us to make. Quote, Luke is the gospel author who writes most self-consciously as a historian. In the preface to his work, he writes, Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed. End quote. So, just a couple of things to point out here before we get to Dr. Craig's commentary. First of all, let's remember that in this culture, at that time, all it took to be an eyewitness was to have a dream or a vision like the Apostle Paul did. When Luke says eyewitness, he ain't using the term the way we would today, and that's important. And second, notice he says these stories was delivered to us, not to me personally. A lot of folks uses this passage to claim that Luke went around personally interviewing individual eyewitnesses firsthand, and he ain't saying that. All he's claiming is that he's writing down what he calls an orderly account of a bunch of stories that supposedly originated with what he calls eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And come to think of it, there's a third point worth mentioning, and that's the fact that Luke claims that as of the time of his writing, there was many others who had written gospels before him. And we know that Luke knew about Mark's gospel on account of he quotes it verbatim quite a bit. And John didn't write his gospel until very late in the first century or early in the second, which leaves Matthew as the only other canonical gospel that Luke could be referring to. And if there was only one or two other gospels that Luke knew about, he wouldn't have called it many. Now, Dr. Craig wants us to believe that the canonical Gospels was all written before the apocryphal Gospels, as if there weren't no non-canonical Gospels written early on. But Luke tells us that he knew about many Gospels that was already written before he wrote his. So either Luke was written a lot later than Dr. Craig would like us to believe, or else the non-canonical Gospels was written a lot earlier than he'd like us to think. And either way, that's a big problem for Dr. Craig. Now, I imagine that he'd like us to assume that they weren't nothing important in them other Gospels. But danged if they ain't a fourth point here as well, because even though Luke knew about many other Gospels written before his, he apparently weren't happy with any of them. And that's why he felt like he needed to write his own Gospel so Theophilus could, quote, know the truth, unquote. There was many Gospels saying things that, in Luke's opinion, weren't the truth, which is kind of ironic in the light of Dr. Craig's contention that it takes 2 or 3 centuries for untrue stories to develop. But anyways, back to Dr. Craig and his commentary. The point that he wants to make here is that Luke sounds more like an actual historian than the other Gospel writers do. Quote, This preface is written in classical Greek, such as the great Greek historians used. After this, Luke switches to a more common Greek. End quote. Or, and hear me out here, the reason the preface is written in a different style of Greek is because most of the Gospel of Luke was copied from parts of the many other Gospels that he mentions, and only the preface was actually his. You think? But by the way, there ain't no such thing as a special dialect of Greek that was only used by historians. Classical Greek was used to write both histories and myths, and the Koine Greek used in the New Testament is more like a street Greek as opposed to a literary Greek. Saying that classical Greek was the Greek used by the great historians is like saying that Fox News broadcasts on television, which is the same medium as was used to broadcast the moon landings. The reliability of the latter ain't any guarantee that the former is equally reliable. But Dr. Craig wants us to assume that it is. Quote, "But Luke has put his reader on alert that he can write, if he wants to, like the learned historian." End quote. And this is what I call tone of voice apologetics. If you talk in an authoritative tone of voice and use the mannerisms and vocabulary of an expert, you can fool some folks into thinking you's an expert even when you ain't got no idea what you's talking about. And if we can learn one thing from social media, is that not everybody who talks like an expert actually is an expert. It's all well and good that Luke can write as if he's an expert, but that ain't evidence that he actually is one. And yet that's the argument that Dr. Craig's going with here. Quote, "He speaks of his lengthy investigation of the story he's about to tell and assures us that it's based on eyewitness information and is accordingly the truth." End quote. And you can get similar assurances for just about any conspiracy theory on the internet today. Dr. Craig expects us to believe that Luke did, in fact, conduct a lengthy investigation and is reporting eyewitness testimony just because Luke says he did. Or in other words, we're supposed to believe whatever he says just because he says so, and that's gullibility again. If you read through Luke's gospel, it's obvious that he ain't giving us an investigative report. He ain't documenting where he was getting his sources, nor what conflicts he found between the different stories, nor what criteria he used to figure out what the actual truth is likely to be. All we get in Luke's gospel is a series of stories from unidentified and unverifiable sources that he reports uncritically as being, quote-unquote, the truth. Of the many gospels he says was written before his book, he's picking and choosing whatever story seems right in his own eyes, and then setting them down in what seems to him to be the right order. You can see folks doing similar today, even when their so-called research is nothing more than clicking on a bunch of clickbait. There ain't no cross-examination or fact-checking in evidence here. It's just a bunch of claims. And by the way, who even was this feller Luke? Dr. Craig finds his answer by jumping to a conclusion based on some pretty flimsy evidence. Quote, "He was clearly not himself an eyewitness to Jesus' life, but we discover an important fact about him from the book of Acts. Beginning in the 16th chapter of Acts, when Paul reaches Troas in modern-day Turkey, the author suddenly starts using the first-person plural. We set sail from Troas to Samothrace. The most obvious explanation is that the author had joined Paul on his evangelistic tour. Eventually, he accompanies Paul back to Jerusalem." End quote. But no, that ain't the most obvious explanation, or even necessarily an obvious explanation at all. If he'd joined Paul in the middle of his missionary journey, we'd expect him to say so. After all, as Dr. Craig points out, the preface shows that the author of Luke was trained in classical Greek literature, so it ain't likely that he'd be guilty of such clumsy and confusing writing if he was writing his own first-person experience. The most obvious explanation is that the author of Luke and Acts switched from copying out of a story written in the third person to a different text written in the first person. If Luke was just copying out of other folks' documents, that'd be consistent with the stylistic change from classical Greek to Koine Greek in the first chapter, and it's also consistent with Luke having been written at a time when many other Gospels had already been written. And by the way, did I mention the fact that the writer never identifies himself in either Luke or Acts as being named Luke or as being a physician? That's just another verbal report dating back to the early 2nd century, which means that Dr. Craig has equally flimsy grounds for this conclusion. Quote, "What this means is that the author of Luke Acts was in fact in first-hand contact with the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry in Jerusalem." End quote. And that's all speculation on Dr. Craig's part. He wants the text of Luke and Acts to establish the claims of the Gospels as undeniable truth, so he selects the details and interpretations that support his desired narrative. But now, supposing the author of Luke was actually somebody a lot like Dr. Craig. What if he, too, was selecting stories and advocating interpretations that supported his preferred narrative? What if he also was filtering out contrary information, just as Dr. Craig does next when he says this, quote, "Skeptical critics have done backflips to try and avoid this conclusion. They say that the use of the first-person plural in Acts should not be taken literally. It was just a literary device that was common in ancient sea voyage stories." End quote. Notice that, like Luke, Dr. Craig cites no sources for his claim that skeptical critics makes ridiculous excuses about sea stories always being told in the first person. What's more, this is the only skeptical rebuttal he mentions at all. He filters out even the existence of skeptical criticisms based on the idea that Luke was simply switching from copying one text to copying from a different text. And this is exactly the kind of biased reporting that makes Dr. Craig an unreliable guide to the actual history of first-century Palestine, and it's a bias that's driven by a religious agenda a whole lot like the one that the author of Luke had. Dr. Craig is arguing that we ought to just take Luke's word for everything, but what he's demonstrating is that Luke needs to be fact-checked and cross-examined just like anybody else. Because when reporters is driven by faith, they's likely to focus more on supporting the narrative than reporting the actual unbiased facts in their entirety. And this gets even more obvious as Dr. Craig continues building his apologetic house of cards. Quote, "So who were some of these eyewitnesses? Perhaps we can get some clue by subtracting from the Gospel of Luke everything found in the other Gospels and seeing what is unique to Luke. When you do this, what you discover is that many of Luke's unique narratives are connected to women who followed Jesus." End quote. But again, this is pure speculation, and it disregards the fact that Luke said there was many Gospels that had already been written before he started his. And we don't know what was in most of them other Gospels, so there ain't no way we can subtract them all from Luke's. Dr. Craig's just doing what believers always does, grasping at any straws that seems to reinforce the narrative. But now we come to the very heart of Dr. Craig's argument here, cherry-picking whatever mundane details Luke got right in order to claim that everything else he reports must be accurate also. Quote, "Again and again, Luke's accuracy is demonstrated. From the sailings of the Alexandrian corn fleet to the coastal terrain of the Mediterranean islands to the peculiar titles of local officials, Luke gets it right." End quote. And you know, I can just imagine Dr. Craig stumbling across an anonymous post in 2005 claiming that John F. Kennedy's assassination was the result of space aliens using their telepathic powers to do a mind control thing on Lee Harvey Oswald. And I can imagine Dr. Craig noticing the amazing historical accuracy of the guy making the post. He reports that JFK was riding in a kind of a vehicle called a car, and specifically a kind of car called a convertible. And historians can confirm that in the 1960s, folks did ride around in cars that they called convertibles. He reports that the assassination happened in a city called Dallas, in a state named Texas, and historians confirm that Dallas was indeed a city in the state of Texas at that time. He reports that in the same car was a man named John Connally, who happened to be governor of Texas at the time. And what do you know? John Connally was indeed the governor of Texas during that time frame. Again and again, this anonymous poster gets his historical details exactly right, from the name of the plaza where JFK was shot, to the name of the building the sniper was hiding in, to the name of the hospital and the name of the vice president who succeeded him. He even spells Jacqueline Kennedy's name right. How could he achieve such amazing historical accuracy in 2005, more than 40 years after the event he was reporting? Well, Dr. Craig reads through the comments on the post, and he finds a comment posted in 2019 by somebody who said he heard a rumor that the anonymous post was posted by a user named UFO Menace 1963, who was good friends with another user named Saucer Victim 1980, who was actually abducted by aliens. And apparently, them two hung out a lot together and probably went back to Roswell, New Mexico, where UF Menace 1963 would have met with a bunch of other folks who also saw or was abducted by aliens. So this anonymous post must definitely have been based on eyewitness testimony accurately reported. So would that lead Dr. Craig to conclude that telepathic aliens was behind the assassination of JFK? Well, maybe not, because I kind of suspect that he'd be unlikely to give UFO conspiracy theories the benefit of the same kind of argument that he uses for Luke, because it's just a bad argument. Nobody would apply that standard as a general criterion for evaluating whether or not a given claim was true. Accuracy in irrelevant details ain't evidence for controversial claims. The only reason Dr. Craig offers such a flimsy argument is on account of he's desperate for anything he can use to validate the claims of the gospel. Dr. Craig wraps up this argument with yet another appeal to gullibility. Quote, "On the basis of the 5 reasons I listed, I personally think that we should assume the historical reliability of what the Gospels say about Jesus unless they are proven to be wrong. But in any case, at the very least, we cannot assume that they are wrong until proven right. We should at least adopt a position of neutrality." End quote. So his preferred approach is for folks to read the Gospels with an explicit and deliberate bias in favor of believing every single thing they claims unless and until they can be proven false. And you better believe he's going to set the bar as high as possible for what he accepts as being genuine proof. I reckon he'd insist on out of reach as a bare minimum. He does mention the possibility of falling back to a position of neutrality as a last resort. And that comes kind of close to the standards that genuine historians actually applies. They don't assume that any claim is necessarily true or false. They take each claim and look at the evidence to see if there's real-world data to corroborate the claim. That's the approach that Dr. Craig should be advocating here, but unfortunately he can't, because you can't get to his desired conclusions without adopting gullibility as your primary criterion for quote-unquote truth. And Dr. Craig ain't just admitting that believers takes a gullible approach to the Gospels, he's actively and enthusiastically evangelizing in favor of taking the gullible approach, which is all the more reason why we ought to take his apologetic arguments with a big old grain of salt. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to enlighten us on what he calls the criteria of authenticity, including one of my personal favorites, the criterion of embarrassment. And I was looking forward to it. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.